Hey everybody, welcome to today's member forum, The Fight Against Russian Aggression with former CIA Spymaster Jack Devine. Amanda Mattingly, who is the chair of the World Affairs Council Members Forum Steering Committee, is today's moderator. I'm going to introduce Amanda, who's then going to introduce Jack. When we get to the question and answer part, please raise your hand. I hope everybody knows how to raise your hand on Zoom, but in case you don't, first, if you click on the participants thing at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's something that says participants, click on that. And then out to the right, you'll see the list of participants. And at the bottom of that participant screen, there's a button you can click that says raise hand. I'm raising my hand now. Y'all should all be able to see it, right? Okay, cool. So, Amanda Mattingly is Senior Director at the Arkin Group, LLC. It's an international risk consulting firm. Amanda and I have worked together in the U.S. Embassy in Caracas, Venezuela, where she was absolutely outstanding. Besides her work at the Arkin Group, Amanda publishes her own opinions in a number of media outlets around the U.S., including it showed up, I think it was on CNN, but it showed up this morning on the KCTV website. So I'm just going to turn this over to you, Amanda. It's now, I'm going to mute my mic and it's your show.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I appreciate it. And welcome everyone to the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Today it's a members forum event, and we are so lucky to have with us the legendary Spymaster Jack Devine. He's also the author of a new book that is called Spymaster's Prism: The Fight Against Russian Aggression. Jack is a 32-year veteran of the CIA. He served as acting director and associate director of operations, and was in charge of the CIA's largest and most successful covert action operation, which drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. Jack is the founder and president of the Arkin Group, and as Mr. Ambassador said, it is an international risk consulting and intelligence firm. So for full disclosure, everyone, I have known Jack a long time, and so I will try not to preempt his answers, even if I may have heard them before, right, Jack?
Feel free. What's the job anyway?
We're so happy to have you here today, Jack. It's really a privilege, and it should be great fun. I know we'll have some great questions from the audience, but I'd like to start, if I could, as the moderator, by asking you a couple of questions. And first, I want to ask you about the ongoing spy v. spy struggle between the United States and Russia. So in lots of ways, the espionage cases and the covert action operations, proxy wars and so forth really defined the Cold War. But I wonder, is it as relevant today? And from where you sit, do you see Russia as much of a threat to the United States today as it was in the past? And also, do you see Russia as much of a threat today as, say, China?
Well, Amanda, there are a couple of good, really tough questions put together there. Let me try and unpack them. The book itself, Spymaster's Prism, is a look from my perspective as an intelligence officer that spent many years in the intelligence business, much of it in the Cold War, looking at Russian intelligence. So then let me take the back end of your question, Amanda. Everyone's expecting anyone to go out on the stump to say, China is our #1 threat, and why are we wasting time on Russia? But the truth of the matter is, China is indeed, when you think about the geopolitical, military, economic challenges it presents, I would put it at the top. I'm both in nuclear weapons, and there's mutual destruction in all of those relationships. But where I was looking at it was, which of the great powers are really zeroing in on meddling inside the United States in its political process? This is an issue I've been really seized with since, well, for a long time, but it came to head in the 2016 election. So I think on this aspect of it, I think we are really underestimating the Russians, and I dwell on this in the book. Amanda's predicate to that is the spy business is active as it was during the Cold War. The challenges is great. And I would say, absolutely, I wouldn't hesitate in answering. What was interesting, when the Cold War came to an end, there was in fact a contraction in the American budgets, and there was a lessening of interest. It was harder to get around the single mission. And after the Soviet Union fell for a temporary period, it was really very temporary, the KGB fell apart, literally fell apart. Few pockets stayed, and they continued to handle some key spies, and we'll get to that at some point. But the Soviet Union, after it collapsed and was reconstructed as the Russian state, their intelligence people went back to work, and we'll get into it later on. Putin's role on it. I wrote an earlier book called Good Hunting in 2014, and Ambassador reminds me that I came down to Atlanta, got the most expensive haircut I ever got. Amanda took me to really a high-end place. I it ruined our budget for the month, but I then realized that she was walking on the high end of the street. But when the book came out, in the last chapter, I don't get everything right by any stretch of the imagination. But one thing that I did state in 2014 is that terrorism would wane as the core focus of our concerns. And it's not going away. We've always had it. In the 70s, it was rampant. And again, today we're still looking at it. And we have domestic terrorism that we've got to worry about. But the real challenge going forward, and as far as I can see in this century, would be wrapped around nationalism and state governments. Power will be focused between nation states. And that's where we are today. When we look at the world, you have a very strong leadership in Russia, China, Iran. In fact, if you look at many of the second-tier nations, they're run by strong autocratic, semi-autocratic leaders. So our budgets are adjusting, and our focus is. And I started writing as I get into the book, and again, I don't want to go too far and preempt your questions.
Yeah, well,
let me troubled by the Russian intelligence activities.
Well, let's talk about Putin. You raised the issue of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Tell us a little bit about him. In your book, you write about Putin as the spy master president. What does that mean? And can you talk a little bit about what you see as Putin's objectives, his goals? For example, what is he doing in Syria and Ukraine? How do we understand his objectives here in the United States, or even at home in Russia? What is he doing to silence an activist like Alexei Navalny? How can we wrap our minds around Putin, and how should we look at him, Jack?
Well, I think in the context of this nationalism, the new Russia, if you will, it's not a communist state, it's nationalism. When you centralize power in one person, you better really understand that person and what motivates them. So I have a chapter, as Amanda rightfully points out, called The Spymaster's President, and it's Vladimir Putin. But right below the title is a subtitle, and it's a quote, and it says, "There is no such thing as a former KGB officer, Vladimir Putin." So from Putin's perspective, he sees himself as in the mindset of a KGB officer. Now, if I were making a speech, I might say that there is no such thing as an ex-CIA officer either. And I think what that really means is we're not on the payroll of the US government, but we have a prism, a way of looking at the world that is an intelligence perception. So when you look at Putin, from his early youth, when he was 17, he tried to join the KGB, and he was rejected, and eventually was accepted and was, and so an elite group. And so he had all the qualifications necessary. But unlike many of his peers, and I dealt with his peers in different countries around the world, but he was in Dresden, East Germany. He wasn't in Paris and London enjoying the fine wine and life of the West. He lived in the dark, Cold War of Eastern Germany. And for some of you who like to read novels, like Horace Carla's focused on East Germany in that time frame, and Marcus Wolf was the real Carla. And so he lived in that environment, a dark environment. And that's when his world fell apart. That's when the Soviet Union fell apart. He decided at that point he was going to do whatever he could whenever an opportunity presented to rebuild Russia in the vision of a powerful state. So when you look at his behavior, and he was very successful. I mean, you have to realize he's a very talented operator, because at a very early age in a country of strong infighting among the bureaucratic leadership, he emerged as the man, and he consolidated his power. And, you know, we can go into a lot of the details about that, but Amanda's point is, what's his objective? And this, to me, is the central theme of the book in some ways. When you decide that you're going to create the world order, and you decide that you're going to recreate the Tsarist objectives, or the objectives of the Soviet Union, which were to weaken all of the neighbors, to have warm water ports, to make sure that Ukraine was part of the empire, because Russia without Ukraine is a much smaller player. Its GDP is closer to Spain or Italy's, but with the Ukraine, it's a much more powerful economic force. And one of the other characteristics of the Cold War is to try and keep the US off balance and to weaken the United States. It's not to have a world revolution by communism, but to weaken it. So when we look at the world and activities of Putin today, and whether it's in the stands in the neighboring countries, intimidation, going into the Crimea, warm water ports in Syria, or meddling in our internal affairs, which I want to make really clear, is different than the Cold War. We had an understanding under what we call the Moscow rules that we would not do that. And he's violated that. And it gets to Amanda's point about what's the strategy. The strategy.
Let me ask you, can you explain what the Moscow rules are for everyone? I'm not sure folks might not be familiar with that term.
Right. There are actually two usages in modern times of Moscow rules. There's one that's generally known. In fact, most agency people would respond by saying, oh, that's how you operate inside Moscow. You know, you don't wear an Atlanta Braves hat. I mean, you don't talk in English in a loud voice in a restaurant. So they're, you know, basic common sense rules on how to behave and operate. And they tend to be generally perceived. But there's an older one that predates my entry into the agency, in which from the very beginning, there was an understanding that, and it's not written, you can't find it anywhere. There were certain things neither side would do during the Cold War. And for example, counterfeiting. Neither side counterfeited the other's currency, even though the capacity to do so was there. Why? We would have ruined the financial institutions, so that we ruined our own country in the process, so because they couldn't reciprocate it. We didn't do that. We had some ground rules that we wouldn't beat up each other's officers. Now that was violated a couple of times, but by and large, those rules were adhered to without any written document. But fundamental to it was that we were not going to meddle. We would fight all around the world, toe to toe, whether it was Afghanistan, Chile, take your pick, Italy in 1948, but we would not interfere directly inside each other's countries. There is one or two minor glitches on that on the Russian side. But, you know, I had unique access inside the CIA for many years. I overlooked it. I did the history of it. And I would tell you that we are not meddling inside internal Russian affairs. Now, Putin refers to it, but unless his own intelligence service is slipping, he knows full well that we are still not meddling in causing turmoil inside his country. But the 2016 Special Commission by Mueller clearly lays out how the Russians were very much involved in interfering in our election, and we can talk in great detail. But I want you to know that's different. That is not the ground rules. And so therefore, we do not have an understanding. And Amanda, I want to finish with one observation in this. The biggest thing that has changed in my lifetime in the intelligence business is it's in the technical area, the internet, social media. It has changed big data. All of these things have revolutionized it. So when you say he's playing in the United States, he's playing with new tools. It's not giving $50 to some group to try and form a committee and make an announcement. It's getting deep into our Facebook with 2,000 sites and 12,000 Twitter feeds and on and on. So you're really talking about using the muscle of cyber, and there are no ground rules. And that's something that I think the public and our policymakers need to come to terms with. We're not going to have a treaty. There is no way you can have a treaty on cyber. You can't come to a meeting and saying, well, we all agree, right? We're all hacking into everyone's system, right? So you're not going to have that meeting. The difference is you can have a meeting, a private meeting, about do you use that information? And that's where there's a big gap. And I'm worried that there'll be a miscalculation.
Right.
And it begs the question of how do we respond to it?
Right. It's a good question. Well, let's open it up to questions from the audience, from our members here at the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. I will call on you all as you raise your hands through the Zoom feature. And you can, then I think you'll unmute yourself and you can ask Jack the question directly, if that works. Okay. Here we go. Charles, you've got the first question. Charles, hello. You need to be unmuted.
Okay.
There
okay.
we go.
I tried it for a while. It said I could not, that you wouldn't allow me. We had
new rules of the road here.
Yeah, there you go. We're going to do the Atlanta rules. We had a program yesterday with former Senator Sam Nunn. And I mean, I had never thought about this before, but holy cow, he talked about hacking into early warning systems. So that either the Russians or we think we're under attack, when in fact we are not. And that not necessarily it being the Russians or us, but a third party doing that is how. I mean, this is something completely new. You talk about the technological changes during your career. I mean, that's just an extraordinarily dangerous development. And how do we deal with things like that?
Well, I haven't seen Sam Nunn in a long time, and I would be inclined to disagree with him, but I'm of the mind that our government understands that problem, that early warning problem, and has invested billions, might be tens of billions of dollars in protecting that one category of information. So I wouldn't think of certainly the Russians wouldn't plan to have it look like someone else was starting under, a warning in a war, right? You're back to the mutual destruction. So the question is, would someone with less skill be able to attack that? And I would say, very, very remote. Well, that's not Sam's whole point. I mean, I think we're really talking about our entire defense structure is vulnerable. And there, I do think the Russians are deep into our system. And, we just saw the recent assault on State Department and DHS and Treasury. So I think Sam's fundamental point is, there's not enough money in the world to completely protect you at every turn. It's one of the reasons why I still believe in human intelligence. And that is, at least if you have a spy that's somewhere near the decision-making process, you can get a reading on this. But I do think that the Russians are very aggressive. The Chinese are very aggressive. And I would hope that we're really aggressive in being able to collect the information that enables us to counter counter that. But I come back, Charles, again, it's a question of use. And the way you described Sam's description, that's really extraordinarily dangerous water. And I'm worried that we might start, and Putin may be starting at a lower level, but the more you end up with brinkmanship, you get to a point where things like that start to be on the people's minds. That can we do something really cute here? And that's why I'm so troubled by it. I mean, I do think we have a handle on nuclear weapons, and we have treaties, and we know where the missile silos are. We know we're going to destroy each other. On cyber, bringing down the grid, why the Russians could do it, and we could surely do it to them. I think there's an understanding that's not been articulated. I think both sides are assuming that will not happen. And I'd like to get from assumptions into some, as I said, some rows of discussion to delineate and come up with some agreements.
Thanks, Jack. The next question we have is from Donald Stevenson. Donald, if you want to unmute yourself and you can ask Jack your question.
Yeah, quick question. Russia's mainly a petro state, and they've used that energy leverage over our allies in Europe. I'm curious to what extent you think the current administration is going to try to block the Nord Stream pipeline, and to what extent they ought to spend political capital as well as building, liquid nitrogen terminals to counter that. So kind of the leverage of energy that Russia has over our allies in Europe.
That's a good question, a really good question, actually. One of the things that I think is missing today that was certainly very visible in the Cold War is the bipartisan nature of national security. When I would brief the Senate committee, certainly during the Afghan days, we're working against the Russians, you couldn't tell the difference between a Republican and Democrat about how they wanted to handle that account, right? So when you look at Nord Stream, I mean, if I wanted to find some hope here, I actually think that the Trump administration took a hard line, and I believe the Biden administration will take a hard line on Nord Stream. And the reason is, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that this is not in our interest for the reasons, Donald, that you raised. But it also weakens the Ukraine, and it makes your vulnerable, you pointed to this, it makes it vulnerable to Russian pressure. And so I would expect, and this is the good news, not everything has to be different between one administration and the other. And what I'm hoping is that sensible people will come together and will broaden the areas of national interest agreement, because I do think there are many areas where reasonable people that are steeped in the knowledge of these problems can come together. And this may be the most obvious and best one, Don, so I'm optimistic. Having said that, all politics are local, as Tip O'Neill said. And the Germans are going to look at it and say, look, we need to make sure the Americans aren't too unhappy here. We don't want to also have a Russia problem. But at the end of the day, it could well come down to the economic considerations, and they may decide to go that way. So I find some hope in the fact of bipartisanship. I'm not sure the outcome is going to be positive, but it's sure worth the effort.
Jack, you had mentioned in one of your in your response, I think it was to Charles actually, about you had sort of alluded to the SolarWinds hack. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how you see us vulnerable to Russians from that? I just want you to have the opportunity to expand a little on that, if you would.
Well, I don't think I was shocked by it. I mean, in fact, quite the contrary. But there's an aggressiveness in this. We historically have anticipated that adversaries would be attacking defense-related areas. But when you go into treasury and defense, I mean, you broaden your attack range. And they went in and they found a vulnerable link there that allowed them to go further and further into many companies. So there's an very aggressive part. But the point that I would really leave you with, my own experience tells me that they're much deeper into the system, that this is one operation that was a little more robust, but I have a feeling that there are more compartmented things that they do that get right at the core of our weapon systems and so on. And I hope our defense system, we spent a lot of money on it. I'd like to feel more comfortable than I do that it has been a full deterrent. So, we're banking on all of our top line weapon systems working. I'm not as confident that they haven't been compromised.
What do you think that I still grapple with the issue over what does Russia gain by undermining us in all of these various avenues? How does that, if we put sanctions on Russia, and the EU puts sanctions on Russia, and we get in that pattern, how does that benefit, or what is the end goal for Putin? How does that benefit his position?
Well, one of the things that I was a teacher, by the way, that's why I love doing some of the things. I'm not saying I was a great teacher, but I love imparting information. That's why I write books, and that's why I speak. But if I were giving a grade to Putin, I'd give him an A for tactical execution. I think he has demonstrated an ability, a logic and reason within his prison to execute, and execute very, very well. I'd give him an F for his strategy and his strategic thinking. And that is, he has bought into a stale old view, the Dresden mentality, if you will, of how the world ought to look like. And I actually think Russia would be better off, the world would be better off if they worked to have, to be integrated into the Western world, and that it had opened up for democracy and discussions and free reign of speech. So I think he's picked a different strategy, and I think from his perspective, it's successful. In other words, his intervention in 2016, I was stunned by it because I thought this is kind of silly, just the way you were describing. What are you going to get out of this? I mean, it doesn't make sense. Are you sure he did it? Maybe it was someone lower. Well, but the more I looked at it and I began to look at their strategy, they have a hybrid strategy. And the hybrid military strategy involves the use of propaganda, disinformation, and cyber, right? So when you look at it, and there was a famous spy we had on our payroll who was the deputy chief of KGB, who was called the SVR today, and then in New York City, where he was the hub of all the information. So when we talked to him, he said, well, when I joined the KGB, the number one target was the United States. Number two was NATO. Number three was China. And today when I left, the number one is the US, number two is NATO, number three is China. Meaning that he stuck with this idea that somehow the US is an inherent adversary, an enemy, and competitor of the United States. And I think he misread that. I think most Americans really don't have that hang up. Most political leaders would rather see Russia in the mix. And with the Sino-US tensions where they are, it would be a much better world. And I did mention earlier, all the politics are local. If you want to be an autocrat, sometimes it pays to have big adversaries outside of the country, and you blame all the shortcomings. So it may be convenient from his own political perspective.
Right.
One thing I would say, though, at the end is this is a strategy. This is not an accident. This isn't some amateur playing big time politics. This is a serious guy. I just think he's on the wrong foot. And again, it's presumptuous of me to speak to his country, but as a citizen of the world, I would say, you're playing with fire here. For you could be in a much better place if you loosened up.
So the next question is from Jim Sen. If Jim, you want to unmute and ask Jack.
I haven't been to Russia since before COVID, but in my travels, I was always struck by, not surprised, but struck by the difference between the Russian people's feelings about international affairs in the US and so on versus the government. But I want to ask you, related to that in your previous comment, in his confirmation hearings, William Burns referred to Putin having misread American politics and so on. And he said, Putin has a remarkable capacity for storing up slights and grievances and enabling them to fit his narrative of the West trying to keep Russia down. Do you have an opinion on that view?
Well, I think it speaks well of Burns. I mean, he's an expert. He's lived there in Russia, and I'm sure will take appropriate positions vis-a-vis Russia. I wouldn't make too much. I mean, I know you traveled and met a lot of people that have strong and positive feelings about the United States and so forth. But he wouldn't be in power if he didn't have a substantial majority. Okay, it's very hard to rule with you fall of your own weight at a certain point. But when we talk about Navalny, 100,000 people came out in the middle of the winter in Russia, and if you went into winter, you would know that's a pretty strong demonstration of vulnerability and weakness. So I do think, and I think what I was trying to say before Burns was that is indeed right, and his slights and concerns, but he was not the only politician in the national theater that has a thin skin. In fact, Charles, you probably have never met any senior political figure in our government that didn't have a thin skin when it comes to slights and so on. Now, it's not true in the CIA, we're all very immune to that. But my point is, I think he nailed it, and I think this is a good thing. I'm finding, I feel like at times I'm alone, so I'm really glad to hear Burns is in the fray here, fighting back. You know, China's century, everything has to be about China. China's totally important, got to be number one on, you know, the geopolitical scene, but better make some room for Russia, because they'll eat your lunch, you know, as they have over the last few years. If you look at the progress that he made within his agenda, not your agenda or mine, but what he wanted to do, and how that little, what we might say was a little operation in the 2016, how that played out, you'd have to say, if he really knew that was going to happen, I don't believe he did. He never dreamed it was going to turn out as well. And we've been at each other's throats since then.
Right, Jack, you mentioned China again. Just, I don't know if any of you all saw the article in the Washington Post today that suggested, as right after the meeting in Alaska that Secretary of State Blinken had with the Chinese then immediately met with the Russians and demonstrated potential new alliance there. I don't know if I don't want to blow the article, but what do you think of that? Do you think that we're now going to be looking at again a bifurcated world where Russia and China are on one side and the U.S. and Europe are on the other, and those countries are going to have to decide which side they're on? Are we back in that sort of construct?
As Comrade Jay once said, number 3 is China. So and there's a permanency about it. They're neighbors. Now, we're not the only ones that have wise people at the top of our government. And we won't dispute which ones we're talking about. Now, reserve strategists inside the Soviet Russia, and they were in the Soviet Union, their own world. The Chinese are profound thinkers about the long-term play. If you were sitting there, you'd say, well, what's the move? Well, the move is at least let's look like we're really getting together and make the Americans nervous. It's a great bargaining position. By the way, we have a lot of common interest against the U.S. I think they'll try it. It's not the first time in history they've tried to do this, and every time they run into the box. I think there's an inherent difference between Russian and Chinese about how they look at the world. So I don't think it's a permanent problem. We should not contribute to it. We should be mindful of it. But I think it's a good strategy. If I were in their shoes, I would have immediately gone. I used to deal with them, and this is not a secret, so you don't have to get nervous out there in the counterintelligence world. But when I would barter with the Chinese officials and their military leaders for weapons in the Afghan war, there was a program, and you would have to speak first. You would say what you would want. They would go off and come back and repeat what you said, and then add one piece to it. And then there's a format, and you're expected to follow that format. And to my great advantage, I found that if I made the right friendships and we're going to be together forever and whatever against the Russians, when we got to the final last discussion, it was, well, we give you the guns for 150. That's cheaper than anybody else. Then you close the deal and walk out. So there is, and again, there's people, Charles is seasoned in this. I mean, you come to the table, there's a strategy, but no one should ever think that Putin shows up at Helsinki or shows up, or the Chinese shows up in Anchorage. Do not have 10 layers of options that they're going to play out depending which way you're going. And I think we're seeing it. And I think we're good enough to play in that game and win.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Charles, I see your hand.
Yeah, one more, and I apologize for asking too many questions, but you mentioned, Jack, that the Russian economy is slightly smaller than Italy's and slightly larger than Spain's. How do they have the wherewithal to remain involved around the world? How do they afford it? You can see Syria because it's nearby, but can they do more? I'm concerned about Latin America any more than, an occasional ship visit or have a, couple planes land once or twice a year in Caracas. Do they have the ability to project power beyond the near abroad?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One, he's punching above his weight for those that are in the boxing world. So, and he's boxing well above his weight, and that's why I give him an A. So, Charles, the question is, where's that outer limit? How far can they do it off of that base? Kim Jong-un projects power, developing nuclear weapons, long-range missiles. There's a price that's paid inside for those investments. The Soviet Union, its entire career, their people suffered so that they could put a satellite, put weapons. So going back to Putin, he's in that mode. And the only other thing that I would add, and I want to come back to my theme about cyber being at the core of this new world we're in. You can do an awful lot with cyber that's cheap. You don't need, what I'm saying is you don't need to put armies on the ground. And he's exercised this power through intimidation. And when you look at Chechnya, or you look at the Crimea in the Ukraine, relative cost within his program, the way he did it with Green Men, I mean, it's not unlike what we did in Afghanistan, not to swing this in other directions. I'm not a big advocate of I'm for putting our armed forces on the ground as late in the game as you have to. So he's playing in the world of covert action. And this is something that, I speak about in both of my books, the role of covert action and the importance of it. It's a lot cheaper. And pound for pound, he's going to get his money's worth out of it. So I think you're looking at a lot of covert action that he is able to, and it's true in Syria, it's true in Crimea, he's exercising it pretty effectively. And with Venezuela, because we both have an affection for rapists and so on, but when we look at it, he threw some money in there, but it wasn't going to break the bank, but he knew it was going to distract us and it was going to be a problem and an annoyance. And maybe he could play it right. Maybe there'd be a break. But when you looked at it, in the end, he made a financial decision on how much he was going to invest there. And I was in Chile many years ago. I'm not shifting responsibility here. I still believe, and this will start a whole firestorm, that Allende's own economic policies are the root of it. But the Russians decided to pull out long before Allende fell. They cut the money off. They cut the party. The party decided that it was over. So when we're looking at Putin, he's read somebody's handbook on covert action that they left him in the file, and I think he's using it pretty effectively. He could probably do more trouble. I don't know how many places he can actually get on the ground, but he can cause a lot of trouble. So could we.
We have a question from Valerie Lopez. Val?
Hi. Okay, so I feel a little bit silly asking this, but we have a few young leaders on here, so I'm gonna say I'm asking on their behalf. They have their careers ahead of them. How does one end up a CIA spymaster? I mean, maybe you can blame all the shows, but I feel like I can't just submit my resume and work for the
Well,
CIA.
you have to be good looking, witty. Now, the very first thing you have to have a sense of humor, as you can see. That's pretty funny. But the first point, and when I interview people that want to go into the agency, or they look at what's the key ingredient, it is truly a sense of mission. You have to feel like there's something about that institution, about my country, that I believe this institution carries. It's why people go in the State Department. They believe in their country. Public service, I'm terribly disappointed in the number of people that have fallen off in their interest in public service. I went to my high school to give a talk, and afterwards they brought the best and brightest, and I walked around the room, and not one of them wanted to be in the public service, not State Department, not CIA, and they were in the technical world. And I was discouraged by that because of the importance of leadership. So I think wanting to be, and you will not last, I promise you, it's to see the world and live like James Bond, which of course isn't the real world by any. No one, James Bond never writes a report, he never does an accounting, doesn't have wife, children, all those things that are really serious in life. So the point is, you have to have a sense of mission, and you have to be interested in the world. You have to be open-minded about foreign cultures. And then when I look at the CIA and I walked up and down the halls, I really thought I was walking in different neighborhoods, because I could never tell the difference between Republicans and Democrats. It was unprofessional, and it still should be unprofessional to have domestic political views in a place like CIA. You walk through the door, there's a slogan etched in the wall: you should know the truth and it will set you free. In other words, your job here is just give us the facts, tell us what's going on. And so I think the mission is a clear mission that almost any American where they have this sense of mission could apply. But there is a DNA, and one of the beauties of writing the book, both books, you go back and examine your life and you ask yourself, did I belong there? And it's an interesting question with hindsight, and I felt my DNA, I fit there. Now, they may argue that point, but I think I genuinely fit into that world. So you have to make peace with the ambiguities of espionage and the ambiguities of covert action. And I spell out very clear restraints on these things. So, I mean, I think for the young people, if you're interested in the world, you're interested in your country, you want to do something, CIA, State Department, defense of our country, and the military bring great satisfaction to you if that is where you're going. And then if you can specialize a little bit, because the world changes, like, oh, let's study the Arabic, and then you find out that no, it's China now. You spend 2 years learning China, and you find out China suddenly became a democratic state, and they don't send spies there anymore. So I think flexibility and language skills are really important in this day and age. And you got to be able to muster up enough skill in the technology world. You can't walk in, as I did, with a fountain pen and start writing reports. You really need to be at a different level.
Right. Things have changed since then a little bit. I'm going to call on David Heleniak. I think he's having a hard time raising his hand. And then next is going to be Keith Valentine. And then I think we're going to run out of time here. So we'll turn to David and then Keith. David?
Whoops, yeah.
There we go.
Oh, I thought, David, you lost the sense of mission for a minute.
Well, never lose a sense of mission. In December of 1991, Mayor Sobchak was kind enough to invite me to come and give him advice on whether Foreign Bank would open a branch in St. Petersburg. And I met with him, and as you know, he too was a teacher, and his pupil Vlad Putin was in our meeting as well with a couple of others. what I remember most is after telling him it was very clear that no foreign bank would be willing at that time to establish an office in St. Petersburg, we did say if we ever did, they'd want Russians to run it. Where would we get the Russians? And I will never forget Subcheck's answer, which was, we will give you our best graduates. Everyone older than that is ruined. And that would have included his student Vlad, who was in the meeting. So my question after a long-winded introduction is, if Vlad ever leaves the throne, do you think the next generation will be markedly different?
I think he will leave the throne. How, when, I don't know. It's just, if you look at the history of authoritarian leaders, and particularly this day and age, I think they're much more vulnerable than they were. So I think the stage will change. And I think that's an interesting observation on his part, but there's a lot of well-educated Russians today that can do technical things, for sure. The question, the question I have about Russia is, how is Putin going to handle the situation over the next couple of years? And at the core of your point, at 91, when you went there, there was an opportunity. That was an opportunity, but didn't last very long. And we, I thought, responded rather less enthusiastic than I would have been. I'm a Cold Warrior. Look at the track record. I happened to be in Moscow, by the way, in June of 91. If you remember, the coup came in August. And I met the deputy chief of the KGB. He wasn't interested in my advice, I would point out, unlike yours. You were given dollars and cents. And the reason I didn't meet the chief was because he was busy plotting. But I was of the view, even though it was a Cold War, that there was time to reset. And I thought we were slow in taking advantage of all those opportunities. And it gave a window of opportunity for the old system to come back. So to your point, if another opportunity develops where there's an opening and there's a move in moderation, whether it's Putin or post-Putin, I hope we grasp that one and try and make it work this time. And not telling you what to do with your bank and your money, but I wish we would have made that investment. A lot of others would have made the investment. We might be in a different place. So it's great that you met Putin, though. You looked in his eyes and decided that you didn't want to invest them.
The last question goes to Keith Valentine. You had your hand up. Keith?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sort of.
Can you hear me? Mostly, first of all, thank you for the session. Mostly, I was trying to get to David. He was down there waving his hand, and I was going to share just recently, David, I learned there's a little smiley face that says reaction down in the right-hand corner of my box. So it was to get David recognized.
Okay. Well, thank you, Keith. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Excellent job. And Jack, thank you.
Great. Well, we've had some great questions. And Jack, I just want to thank you again so much for your time today and your willingness to entertain us with stories and to give us your perspective on Russia. And yes, everybody, you should buy the book. It's Jack Devine, Spymaster's Prism, The Fight Against Russian Aggression. So thank you all so much. And thanks again, Jack. And over to you, Charles.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks, Amanda. This has been super interesting, and I like the ability to be able to ask questions directly with the cameras on because it helps make that connection. I want to thank everybody in the World Affairs Council, all of you, because you're all members. Delighted to have you here today. This whole last year has been tough with no in-person events. please invite your friends, your family, your colleagues to come to our programs and ideally to join the council. We've got 2 programs tomorrow. At noon, we've got Allison Padilla Goodman, who's the Vice President of the Southern Division of ADL, and by the way, a council board member. And she's going to be talking about what we can do, hate crimes. And then tomorrow at 5:30, our young leaders, this is if you're under 35, we've got a program on negotiating and networking up in a virtual world with career coach Ariel Lopez. It should be terrific. On Tuesday, we've got a program on the post-COVID economy with the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, Raphael Bostic. So please register for those programs. I hope you will join. Hope to see you there. Want to thank Amanda for being a terrific moderator. Valoran, our producer, Laura Brower, our assistant producer, Fernanda Lucchine, who is on the line, has joined us from, I think she's in Costa Rica today. Jack, thank you for spending your time with us. This has been a really interesting 45, 50 minutes now. And I am sure you're going to see a spike in sales as a result of today.
Well, to match the haircut? I mean,
we're going to help pay for the most expensive haircut you've ever had.
She was making a point. Mandy was making a point at that time.
The point was you're not paying her enough.
I got it. I got the point. I really did. Good. I'm afraid to go back to Atlanta.
There you go. Good. Thanks, Jack. This has been great. Everybody, thank you. Everybody have a great afternoon. Bye. Amanda.